Everybody's got their gripes. And if you're fruity like me, you got grapes as well. Ha ha, jokes. I'm Bones McKay, and I have some gripes with how furries tend to be drawn. I find a lot of furry art tends to blend really heavily, and it's hard to tell different animals and species apart from each other, unless it's something wildly different like a reptile. They all tend to blend into sort of the same mold of like vaguely wolfish animal, regardless of any sort of characteristics that the species has. If it's a raccoon, it tends to be a wolf with a puffy tail and raccoon mask rather than a raccoon. This particular talk is going to be how about me and Ursula go about creating furries that read a lot easier as their particular animal. If that's not what you're into, have at whatever you're into. So, now, when we approach creating a furry character, the first step we always look at is how does that animal function? We need to do our studies, because there's a lot you can assume that you know about an animal. There's a symbolic representation of that animal in your mind. Take a coyote in this instance. You know, you think pointy ears, you think wolfish body, downward tail. I don't know, you've got like a vague idea of what a coyote is, but none of that is going to compare with actuality, which is where I will always start from. And if you cannot draw humans and understand them, anthropomorphizing an animal is going to be very tricky too. So all that I'm saying about this step here applies to humans as well, because you're going to want to find a balance of the two of them, and again, very difficult if you don't understand the two components that make it up. This applies as well to mythological creatures. If you do not understand a lion, but you understand an eagle, you better fucking learn to draw a lion before you start drawing a hippogriff. Well, not a hippogriff, but just a normal griffin. Horses would be You know what? We continue. So, we start researching an animal. That kind of comes across as like a vague concept to a lot of you. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. If you haven't been to an art school or taken any art studies, it may be very difficult. And what some of our processing on this is you've got, what I was saying first is you need to set aside whatever your previous understanding of this animal is, and you need to draw exactly what you see. And a lot of this in the very beginning can come from just tracing actual photos of this animal. And you'll start to get a visual library in your head about how the proportions work and what really separates this animal from anything you've drawn before. And that comes from drawing what you see. Drawing what you see often involves tracing. And what comes further from that is as you are starting to trace, you have to have an active approach. You have to be thinking about what you're drawing. You have to be thinking about what you're seeing and how it's actually functioning. Because for a lot of cases, when you're drawing an animal, you do not understand what's going on underneath. There's a lot of fur and skin, lots of loose skin that obscures your understanding of its motions. And that's where, if you have questions, you need to start looking further. You need to understand the skeletal structure of this animal, because underneath all of that fur and loose skin, you will find the underlying structure. What is physically possible for this animal? Why does its leg go there? An example of when we were doing this, looking at a dog's leg is very interesting, I gotta say. The way that it connects is very different to a human leg, and it's not really meant to stand up. And as you look at it further, you start realizing that there's the strong muscles that are meant to kind of push everything forward. The only way that you'd ever come to that realization is A, looking at the skeletons, B, looking at the muscle structure, and C, watching this animal in motion. When you're drawing something simple like a dog or a cat, they're the perfect study to begin with, because how hard is it for you to find a dog that's willing to let you touch its leg and really pick apart like how this works? And fully admitting the fact that I have touched my dog's legs and paws and lifted them up and seen how they bend. When you really start studying and understanding this creature, you're eventually going to be able to move away from drawing specific pictures and start drawing your own made-up poses. always going back to references when you need them, but you need to understand the structure well enough that you can create movement in this animal without looking at a picture. You need to be able to get that read, and that all comes from your realistic understanding of it. And I'll be honest, when you're starting from this point, it can be very frustrating because you're really far away from what you want your animal to look like. You really want the information just given to you. But trust me that learning this process of picking out specific animals and breaking them down and learning how to draw them, that helps you in so many levels. Because one, now you know how to draw animals, and two, you're not basing your understanding for your furry on nothing. Okay? You're basing it on your actual real world experiences with something rather than what someone else tells you. You can look at as many wing tutorials as you want, but until you really dig into it and find your own understanding of it, it's never going to fully translate in a way that really creates this realness and this sense of movement and understanding, and it will make your art so much better, I promise. Now, once you determine that you're like strong enough at drawing animals or the specific animal that you want, and you feel that you can have it move, and you feel like you can have it sit, and you know its face, you know all the ins and outs of it, that's when I move to standing your animal up. And when I stand an animal up, I don't immediately go into my style with it. I don't immediately cartoonize it, because I find that this stage is actually really the hardest, because you're creating something that doesn't exist. You're starting to meld humanity and animal nature. And in order to do this, I start from the animal as a basis rather than the human. So I take the animal and I look, if it's possible, to find pictures of them standing up on hind legs. And if that isn't possible, I look into a similar species and view that standing up. So in the case of a coyote, very easy to find a dog or find pictures of dogs standing up and see how they end up balancing, how everything reorients, and drawing that. And sometimes it can be very hard to find this. Your real basis for it is to consider things like, I'm sure if you're into furries at all, you've probably heard of like digigrade and plantigrade. So if you determine that your animal is plantigrade, look at similar animals that are plantigrade. If you can determine that your animal is digigrade, you can probably find some good examples on digigrade's animals standing up. For your first few sketches of this animal standing up, they're not going to look right, because this animal isn't built to stand on two legs, most likely. So you're going to have to reorient it in a way. You're going to have to shift some of the points of gravity on an animal to create something that can stand up. It involves messing a little bit with the structure of the bottom legs, and a lot to do with the torso, because the torso is very, very different for animals that are meant to be running on four legs, because they don't really have anything built for movable arms and such. Well, when you're doing this, it's very difficult balance, because you have to continue finding what makes this animal unique, what are the proportions that make it unique, and what stops it from being uncanny and unfunctional. There's a lot of testing and shifting, but once you find this underlying structure, you're going to have a great time for the rest of it, and the rest of it's the fun part. So you stay tuned, you do that, and you'll be golden. Once you're golden with this stood up weird animal creature, you can finally, step 3, apply your style. Applying your style is when you start cartoonizing this animal. A lot of it, in our case, involves the facial features, because the facial features are something that really only work in a stylized manner, because dogs and cats and all sorts of animals, they don't really move their face in ways that are really expressive in enough for things like comics, I find. And it's not because animals don't express, but rather you need to humanize it so that someone can relate to it. Because we're humans watching these animals play out. We're not other animals watching these animals play out. And if you want your character to function in a story, you want them to be able to emote in a way that humans can understand, while at the same time balancing out those animal features and key points. At this point, it's very easy to lean back on your old ways, and you kind of have to fight against that. You have to find, again, this melding point. It takes however long it's going to take, but once you start getting a cartoon animal that can express very well, and you feel that it still is able to read as the animal that you have been studying, then you're in the golden spot. That's when you can really start creating characters, which would be once you have this default animal designed, and I mean default, like don't try to push it just yet. If it's a raccoon, it's going to be a raccoon-shaped raccoon. It's not going to be a pudgy raccoon or a lanky raccoon. That comes like the next part. You have your default basic squirrel man. You have your basic default squirrel lady. Once you have this default anthro character, this default furry, you can push it in so many directions. Because you have worked so hard to get to this point, and you understand what makes the animal still feel like that animal, what are the proportions that are needed, you can start pushing it in all sorts of directions. You can really start pushing triangle shapes while adhering to those proportions and those little tells that gives you the animal you like, or you can start making them larger, more square. You will be able to create so much more of a diversity of characters if you understand this default that you've created. And that's really what I'm mostly a proponent of, is just creating this character model and then pushing further and finding those unique aspects that speak to your character, and you'll be able to create something so much more unique this way, and very, very readable. Because if you've done this correctly, your character should instantly read as the animal you've assigned, and then if you apply lots of understanding to character development, you'll create a character that reads as a raccoon that's super cool and sly, or a scummy coyote, or a very sweet coyote. And that's really all there is to it. I would add one caveat, that is, if you ever find yourself sliding, like if you ever find things aren't looking good anymore, go back to the beginning. There's nothing wrong with reestablishing your foundation. In fact, it's a great thing to do. If you make the initial steps super strong, if you really understand this animal, keep doing studies of it. Keep pushing your knowledge. There's so much you can learn, and there's so much you can achieve just by reaffirming what you feel like you understand. Because as soon as your foundation crumbles, you're not going to be able to create the techniques that you want. And even I find, like, whenever I'm jumping back into furry characters, I need to sit down and do some studies of the animals to really start differentiating them. I hope that this is what you were looking for. If not, sorry for wasting your time. Have a good day, y'all. Keeping at it. You dig?